I'm Jan. I'm helping to lead the conversation today. And I'm just so delighted to be at Lancaster and to be the director of the Pentland Centre. It is, for me, a dream come true because I've been watching centres of this type over many, many years and really enthused by how they operate. So I've spent the last 3 months in a state of overexcitement. So I'll try to calm down to be able to maybe make a presentation here. And the purpose of this presentation is to share with you what excites me about my work at the moment. And I'm an academic accountant, so I've got an organisational science background and an interest, but also as a way of maybe highlighting points of connection for colleagues who have intersecting research interests, but also as a point of connection to the Pentland Centre. This is an example of the type of work that happens in the Pentland Centre, which has got a whole systems focus in trying to resolve real world problems in partnership with people affected by those problems, but also having a point of connection through to sustainability and business techniques. So I'm approaching this as an accountant, but also hopefully a whole systems accountant, not a narrow just financial reporting accountant, but interested in accounting's functionality, which I'll speak about later on as well. It also is, it'd be totally dishonest of me to say that this was my presentation, because there are many, many ecosystem of colleagues out there in the world who have informed my thoughts in this area, whose ideas I've shamelessly been stealing and inspired by, and who I have an ongoing collaboration with. And also all the colleagues that push me to do better in this space. And by this I mean the reviewers that are quite often reluctant to publish the papers that I'd like to publish, that really push me to be much more crisp and exact and more ambitious in my own work as well. So I'd like to thank that whole cohort, but particularly the Stockholm Resilience Centre colleagues who have really created a space for me to be able to work in this area, which I so appreciate, and I'll tell you about some of their work because it's underpinning all of my work in this area. So the kind of sort of roadmap for the conversation today is that we'll start with an idea about sustainability science and then run through a series of steps that hopefully one builds off the other and takes you forward. Now, I'll say a wee bit about sustainability science. This is the mode of operation of the Pentland Centre and alongside other centres within University of Lancaster as well, and the Lancaster Environment Centre, Centre for Global Eco-Innovation would be really good examples of sustainability science-inspired work. The idea with this work is that you put a problem, whether it be climate change or forced labour or antibiotics in seafood production, at the centre of your concern. And from there, you build the knowledge that you need to resolve that question. And that might include knowledge from the natural sciences, from the physical sciences, from philosophy, from ethics, from leadership studies, from all sorts of areas. And so it's a very exciting place, because you get to talk to lots of different people about how they perceive the problem, but it also feels a bit of a risky place because it's quite different from our narrow and deep and particular expert silos of expertise. And the place where I really uncovered sustainability science and started to be a bit familiar with how it worked, although I didn't know it had the name at that time, is during the 2000s and into the early 2010s, I was the Scottish Vice Chair for the Sustainable Development Commission. So this was a one-day-a-week public appointment that I did alongside my academic work to support the Scottish Government in addressing sustainability challenges. So we took the Climate Change Act through Parliament, the circular waste economy and zero waste ambitions, through to how do you actually renew housing stock, particularly old houses, in order to be warmer and those sorts of things. And the guide for me on that journey was Tim O'Riordan, who I didn't know at the time as one of the founding fathers of sustainability science. So when I found out that there was a name for what he was teaching us how to do, I went off and like a good academic, spent a lot of time reading about it and trying to understand it, looking at how sustainability science centres operated, what do they do, what kind of research programs that they had. And that all came together in a paper that I published with a very good and long-standing co-writer of mine, Carlos Larranaga, where we laid out how, as an accountant, you could do sustainability science. And be very careful what you wish for, I would say, because from that interaction, it became apparent that there was some sustainability science that we could step in and be involved in. And that's the work in around the keystone actors in the seafood. So to get us to that point, basically, I think there's something for everyone in this talk. An hour's a long time to be on Zoom. So you've got 3 moments where you can relax. So if you are an Earth system scientist that's really on top of keystone patterns in the Anthropocene, you can relax when we're talking about that because you're on the ball, you know what that's about. For those of you who are accountants, when I talk about the nature of accounting as both a technical and a social practice, you can have a wee rest because you know about that. And then finally, for those of you who look at corporate sustainability initiatives and how they operate and how they're constructed, you can have a relax when we talk about that. But what I really like about my work at the moment is that I have to make my way around all the 3 elements of that cloverleaf because they come together in an applied practice-based initiative called Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. So CBOS for short, and I'll say quite a bit about CBOS at various stages in this process. But to kick us off, I'm going to start with the Anthropocene. And this is really the biggest picture of all. It's the idea that, that the Earth has passed through different stages in its life, that those stages are characterized by a combination of chemical, biological and geological bringing together of assemblages, and that those assemblages drive the nature and the functioning of the Earth system. So the glacials, the interglacials, all of these elements that are sort of in the background of our minds as we understand the world in which we live, sit behind this proposition, which is now quite widely accepted, that we've moved from the Holocene into the Anthropocene. So the Holocene has been characterized as a place where most of us as modern humans have lived. It's a nice cozy place. So the temperature's been quite nice. There haven't been any meteor strikes of a large sort. There haven't been huge movements of materials through volcanoes. And so what we've been able to do is flourish in the life that we've created for ourselves, which is pretty carbon intensive and quite resource intensive, in this safe and operating space for humanity. Of course, the Earth is always dynamic. So there's no reason why we might imagine we'd be in the Holocene forever. And also there's no reason to imagine we wouldn't move into another sort of state, which itself will have different characteristics associated with it. But the rate and pace of change between these different epochs is usually, well, it can be quite quick, but it's usually sort of quite slow to a certain extent. And so species come and go. The temperature increases and decreases as carbon dioxide intensities change. And the idea with the Anthropocene is that we've moved outside of that relatively slow moving from a human perspective, slow moving steady state into something else. And in the bottom corner of this slide is one way of articulating that changing world. And so this is the Planetary Boundaries work, which came out sort of 2009 or so, where a group of scientists from the Stockholm Resilience Centre tried to sort of say, well, okay, if we know what the safe space is, how far beyond that are we? And you can see here on climate change is outside of the orange, which is the safe limits. Around climate change, there's the whole IPCC process, there's country processes, there's organisational processes like declaring a climate emergency and what that means for your operations, which the University of Lancaster is part of that movement as well. And so if you like, what you're looking at then is in each one of these planetary boundaries where we've exceeded them, we're trying to understand how we pull them back in. Biodiversity loss is hugely accelerated. And so if you like, the whole worry about natural capital and biodiversity and ecosystem services sit in that one. And while this was a sort of a global scientific investigation and articulation of the problem areas, organisational studies have also noticed this and drawn on this framing to understand what organisations might do. And one of the papers I find very inspiring in this area was by the previous Pentland director, Gail Whiteman, and trying to understand how do we take this science framing and bring it to play into an organisational context. Some of those would be an organisation signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a proxy, if you like, for some of these elements in the Planetary Boundaries Framework. Other ways might be to sign up to targets like 1 degree C through science-based target initiatives, etc. So there is a connection already between this global view of how the world looks and what we might be interested in as organisational scientists. And the proposition with the Anthropocene is not just that it's changing in a more dynamic and fast way and might knock us out of a comfortable space, but the proposition is that human action is a significant source of that change. So the increased loss of biodiversity is driven by land use change and by exploitation of natural resources that will drive some species to extinction. And indeed, we've done that over our whole modern human lifetime. But likewise, and some of these pictures sort of demonstrate some of the other aspects. In the Anthropocene, if you look at the top right, we've moved tons of material around the world, and we've also created novel forms of material that don't have any analogy in the natural world, concrete being one of them, for example, plastics being another, nuclear material being another. And what we've done with that is that we've ended up changing the ecosystem because of those activities. Likewise, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a human, disastrous, but also an economic and an environmental problematic situation where we've created pollution effects, and the greenhouse gas emissions would be the most common and topical example, which is now on everyone's radar, if you like. It was from a few years back. So when, as an organisational scientist, you're looking at these big sort of Earth system moves and you're thinking, right, well, what can I do as a result of that? One of the key concepts is the idea of telecoupling, of how things that happen in one part of the world can have an impact on the other part of the world. And so I've got a slide that I really like, and I'm not sure it's actually about telecoupling, but it's a nice slide for introducing how to think about telecoupling. So this is a pre-pandemic map of world air travel networks and how big the hubs are and how much is moving around. So this is, if you like, a snapshot of where there are certain nodes across a global network and where those nodes connect to other elements on the planet's surface. It's also tells you something about some of the driving effects, and taking the COVID-19, we've watched this in real time about how movement of people and materials, particularly people in the COVID context around the world, transmits effects across time and space. But there are many ways of looking at this. So this is transport hubs. This could also be stock exchanges. And so if you like, stock exchanges where companies are listed are telecoupled nodes that drive material in all sorts of other spaces as well, and across into other ecosystems. Likewise, there are natural systems of this sort. So choices about irrigation within India, for example, will have an effect on rainfall elsewhere in the world, and particularly across in South America. And so what I'm interested in, and where I think organisational studies comes into play, is the idea that organisations are part of these connections that drive particular activities in distant places, from maybe headquarters to a subsidiary, but also that drive impacts across the whole system. And these are complex and dynamic systems that operate in this way, of which there's a huge literature and a whole field of studies looking at the nature of these dynamic and complex systems. So if I try to draw those things together and move forward towards accounting a little closely, what I would argue, and what we argue in the work that I'm involved in, is that in the Anthropocene, people and nature are dynamically intertwined in a way that's actually very immediate and drives these Earth system processes. some parts of the literature that looks at the Anthropocene goes, oh my goodness, people are, the nature-culture distinction that we made during the Enlightenment from a Western perspective is now collapsing in on itself. And I have some sympathy with that, because social sciences often in the past viewed the environmental conditions under which people live as a passive backdrop that sort of rolls along in the back of the play, but what people did were the most interesting things. Whereas now those two things are very firmly intertwined, and you can observe how intertwined they are from the data. But I also, to me, they were never particularly separated, and maybe I didn't go through a decent Scottish Enlightenment. But the Indigenous people of Aotearoa in New Zealand, where I come from, never thought they were separate, and so I realised that I sort of brought up and infused with the sense that these two things are always intertwined. I think what's different now is there's more recognition of that intertwining, but also the consequences of that. If you take that as a starting point, then we start to head towards organisations and accounting a little more specifically in the work that I do. In terms of globalisation, and particularly during the 1950s, that great acceleration where materials and energy flows and the flow of people and the flow of raw resources started to move upwards enormously, but also be spread across the globe. So those telecommunication channels, if you like, were opening up and becoming used more often. The key element behind that, there's all sorts of things like trade markets, etc. But for us, transnational companies are an absolutely essential feature of that and a characteristic of the Anthropocene. So transnational corporations are really interesting entities because they're large, but also they touch down in many different places. And even though subsidiaries might have their own independence, they are driven, at least in part, by head office policies and practices and desires. And then if those transnational companies are listed on stock exchanges, there's a further link back to a rationality of relatively short-term profit maximisation behaviour, which is driven by stock exchange listing. If you're not listed, you've got a bit more room to manoeuvre in that context. So moving from the Anthropocene to globalisation to transnationals, then you're saying, well, human behaviour taken together is often mediated by organisations, and hence organisations mediate our human behaviour across to global environmental change. In this respect, whilst I try to walk a lot more and take public transport, etc., most of my choices about how to travel around, particularly around the world, which we don't do anymore, but we might do again, but to maybe travel around the UK, are mediated by organisations, whether they be bus companies, car companies, if you own a car, or train companies and how we organise the train system. So organisations provide an array of choices to us that some of it rests with me and I can make some choices, but many of my choices are constrained and shaped by organisational activities, and or organisations and I make that choice together about what kind of impact there's going to be. So whilst we're maybe focusing on the climate emergency and trying to address that, I absolutely agree there are things that individuals can do and that I can do as a human being in this system. At the same time, organisations shape and condition a lot of those choices, and they themselves are shaped and conditioned by the governance frameworks that they rest within, which ultimately rests with nation states, and obviously UN processes are above that. Taking the idea of telecoupling, organisations are also nodes for telecoupled systems. And so they're there, if you like, holding hands with distant parts of the world and conveying effects through them. And this will become really important when I come on to the case study I want to talk about, because we are seeing in that some large and quite crucial organisations, which we're going to call keystones, as being really influential in the nature of the outcome of the system, because they are very strongly coupled together and are really important nodes of influence. And in accounting, it's a really amazing practice. Mostly we talk about accounting as controlling organisations and providing information and context within which an organisation can make plans and execute them. So you have budgeting, strategic planning, all of those kind of activities. Alongside it, accounting also provides information into markets to discharge accountability. And that might be financial markets, but it might also be, say, through product labelling into consumer markets, or through reports about how they interact with their local environment, through to communities. So accounting, for me, is a really amazing technology that connects at a distance, that provides control at a distance, but also provides a source of accountability. And I'm not entirely convinced how this next slide fits into the flow of the talk, but it's a series of ideas that I've been really trying to work with and make better sense of. And it's created by Miller and Power, who are two very influential accounting scholars. And they, if you like, have been really important in articulating what kind of social practice accounting is. And they split accounting into 4 different roles. So the first role is that accounting provides a space where people can come together and decide what, a bunch of activities that they might do. Of course, this is the essence of markets in terms of creating these calculative spaces, because as accountants, we do tend to, eventually end up down on the numbers, where we can make some common fields of action. But these calculative spaces could be product costing. It could be, is a division profitable, etc. So creating these spaces where we can make some way of knowing about what's happening and have a common field in which we might create action is quite important. That then comes into this mediating role, and I think accounting as a mediating instrument is massively interesting, because accounting enables that interaction and communication about what work might be needed and how action might be supported. So there's common language developed in around rules for measurement. How do you make a product cost? What kind of ways do you put costing together? What would be an appropriate measure of profit of a division, for example? And what work would happen because of knowing if a division is profitable or not? The next layer then is that once you have agreed on the thing you're going to calculate for, when you've agreed on how to do that, you've now got a basis for evaluation across multiple dimensions, which Miller and Power characterise as adjudicating. And then finally, you get to, therefore, a context where some sort of control can be achieved. And these 4 steps, if you like, underlie a great deal of driving of organisational practice, because organisations are not solely driven by accounting, but the way that they're measured as to whether or not they're profitable, if they're successful, if they're efficient, if they're providing value for money, has this accounting technology somewhere there in the background creating all of these effects. A really good example of this is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is trying to do that mediating adjudication and eventually subjectivization process in order to make this crossover between climate risk and organisational risk. And 30 years ago, and Ken and I were talking about this at the outset of the talk, 30 years ago, a group of scholars came together and said, oh, the environment comes into here somewhere. And at the moment, the environment is outside accounting, but there are accounting tools and techniques that allow us to start lacing environmental understandings of organisational practice through these 4 processes. Incompletely and imperfectly, but they're underlying these points of connections. And I was particularly fortunate to be around at the start of that field, and to have been immensely supported by Rob Gray, who opened the field, but then also to have had some really amazing fellow travellers along the way, including Jeffrey Unerman, who used to be employed here at Lancaster before he passed away. So to try to hook these conceptual pieces together. So if we are living in the Anthropocene, and that's fairly well established, although still open to scientific scrutiny and disagreement, which is appropriate. And if we have accounting as this regime and this complex force that creates certain effects, and if as an accountant I take sustainability science seriously, then you end up coming into the project that I'd now like to describe to you for the remaining half of the lecture. And so some other key concepts to add to this is looking at socio-ecological systems and complex adaptive systems. And we're going to look at the seafood system, which has this characteristic, as many systems of any interest do have. I'm interested in leverage points for behaviour change. And if you like, I'll come on to sort of the underlying mode sitting behind keystone actors, which will sort of provide some of that insight. And in particular, keystone actors as a mode of engagement. And I want to say a bit more about this because this is at the heart of the case study that I'm working on with SRC at the moment, and which, without putting too fine a point on, is the most exciting thing I've ever got to do in my academic career, and keeps me very enthused, as well as awake at night worrying about it sometimes, as you can imagine. So the keystone species is a technical description of species whose presence and role have a disproportionate effect on the shape of an ecosystem. A very good example will be what happened to Yellowstone Park when wolves were reintroduced. It had an effect on deer populations, which affected tree growth, etc., etc. There'd been a long-standing stream of work that came before people alighted on this idea that there is a keystone species, and a great deal of scientific work across lots of different ecosystems to realise that keystone species are these shaping species. Sometimes they, they're quite unusual things, but they're really important. So what happened, particularly in conversation with folk at the Stockholm Resilience Centre, is that there was a thought, a spark, an absolute moment of inspiration of saying, well, are there keystone actors in the global corporate landscape? So is there something like keystone species in our economies who collectively are large enough and integrated enough, picking up on that telecoupling idea, to shape the system in which they operate? And this is the case study of what we believe is some seafood keystone actors that would allow us to actually work that out in real time. And so it's an open hypothesis, but one that we're busily gathering data on, that if corporate actors who are in these spaces come together and agree a series of actions and then undertake those actions, then we might end up transforming the shape and the nature of the industry in which they operate. And that seed of an idea has been picked up in other places as well, looking at keystone actors in corporate settings, as well as keystone actors in other areas as well. So I'm just there's a few examples here. The first one I'm going to spend a lot of time on, so I won't say anything about this now. But there's also a more recent paper that looks at the global network of ports that support high sea fishing efforts. And so you've got a relatively small number of harbours that support 84% in this case of the fishing effort. And this isn't a surprise to us. This is the whole 80-20 rule, isn't it? That, that these two things sort of drive together. But what this would suggest that if ports are important areas in which you might be able to exercise control, which is one of those accounting functions that we're looking for, then you don't have to do it for all of the harbours and ports. You can look at some, and they will, if they have protections about landing illegal fish or making sure that people that are joining boats are not going into forced labour, then they would have a disproportionate effect on the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve. Likewise, Robert, who I think is on the call somewhere, so a big shout out to him, has looked at genetic resources from the ocean and particularly marine linked patents. And one company has registered 47% of all those patents. So this raises questions about enclosure of the commons, and in this case the genetic commons, and fairness and access to these resources. But it also tells you that there is a single company, and along with one or two others, who actually are the people who are the potential guardians of that genetic resources material and the sequencing of it. The Ocean 100 is another final example, and I haven't put the full references to all these because they're quite big author sets. But if you hadn't picked up on these and you wanted to know about any of them, just drop me an email. I'm happy to pass the papers on to you. So this is looking at the largest 100 ocean industry companies across a range of sectors who, if you like, collectively are going to be in the ocean space. and looking at how big they are, where do they operate, what kind of work do they do, what kind of environmental accounting, corporate social responsibility predispositions do they have. And the reason for thinking about these is the idea, which I think is reasonably fraught, but is a really important idea to open up, is to ask the question of whether or not corporates could become stewards of the biosphere. Now, of course, there is a sense in which that a lot of the conversation of this issue falls into two categories, with people saying, oh, let's leave the companies out of this because they've done enough harm, through to people saying, yeah, for sure, pass over the commons to companies and markets and everything will be fine. Of course, the messy middle is where the real questions lie. And so again, it's an open question about whether or not corporations could become biosphere stewards. My very favourite paper on this, which is in the references at the back of this set of slides, looks at a whole series of industries. And yeah, you might be leaning into your computer at the moment to be able to see it, and I will as well. So you've got agriculture and forestry and seafood, agri-chemicals, etc. Then you've got the fossil fuels and the mining companies. This is a keystone analysis across all of these sectors, trying to identify whether or not a small number of firms have the largest share of the activities within that sector. And so, for example, 10 coffee companies have 40%. So that's, I don't know if that's good or bad. So this is an interesting point. You have to figure out how concentrated is hugely concentrated. But you can see there's more concentration, say, in the platinum side of things, which is in your top right-hand bit of it, with 5 companies mobilising 91% of those resources. And so what you've got here is basically 200 companies, transnationals. Some of them owned privately, some of them owned publicly, some of them owned with a mix, who mobilise via their global practices all of these materials. And this is also the essence of what we have with the CBOS set of companies in terms of, in this diagram, the CBOS companies are often the seafood sector. So this, if you like, is now taking this wee blue bit of the map here and looking at it in more detail. And the way to describe this then, this is a sustainability science and action research project looking at seafood businesses and to see whether or not they might be able to become ocean stewards. And the seafood businesses have been selected through a keystone process of analysis. The website there is to CBOS itself, which is an industry initiative, so they have their own independent life, relatively recently got their own independent life. But the whole thing is a partnership between a group of scientists and a group of businesses to try to see what we might be able to do jointly in this space. The 3 components of the seafood business is there, the catching of the fish, which is something that we usually think of when we think of seafood. Down the bottom, aquaculture settings of growing of fish in all sorts of places. Salmon within UK waters would be a very large proportion of activity of that sort that you would have seen. And then up in the top right-hand corner is the feeds and oils business. So CBOS brings together these 3 elements of the industry because, of course, they're all interconnected. So the kind of fish that we might eat, particularly if it had been freshly caught and we were eating at a restaurant, if you like, comes from one part of the mix. But if we're eating salmon, then it's come from aquaculture, but it's got wild capture sources, gone through a feeds company and with other materials to come to our table as a farmed fish. So these 3 things are intimately interconnected. One of my SRC colleagues, John Baptiste, started to look then at what does the seafood industry look like. And remember that we had this idea, well, he had this idea and his colleagues had this idea that the size of the company might matter in this context and they might also have a keystone pattern. And so what you've got here is your revenues and profits of these firms, and you see that there are some very, very large companies in this mix, and then it falls off. So this is quite a big data set, but the largest 13 have a disproportionate impact because they are the largest. They're interconnected. A lot of them are vertically integrated, and they operate all over the globe. So looking at this group, what the project did, and I joined it after this stage and was very exciting to join it, is that you can characterise these players from an economic perspective, but you can also characterise them ecologically as well. So starting with the corporate characteristics. This is the corporate characteristics in a summary form. The blue splodges is the number of companies that these corporations operate within, and the pinky coloured circles are the number of subsidiaries that they have. And these are the largest 13. There's a bit of a concentration in Norway, as you can see, one Spanish, one across in the US, a couple in Thailand, one number 9 in China, one in South Korea, and then another wee cohort in Japan. And this is where, the different size of the circle depends how you wish to organise your corporate activities as to how many countries you want to operate in, given what you're doing, but also how many subsidiaries you want to structure in around them. So some of these companies are listed on stock exchange. Some of them are subsidiaries of larger companies again, and then some of them are family owned. Others have quite large family owned characteristics within them. Particularly for my accounting colleagues and sort of business study colleagues on the talk, this is a data set that you would never imagine putting together from a normal science accounting perspective, because it's not the same country of incorporation. It might even, if you weren't ecologically minded, they might even look like quite separate industries in terms of wild capture to feeds to aquaculture. Likewise, they're not all listed, so they're not all going to have readily available data about them from a corporate characteristics perspective and databases. But this is a keystone sample, so it does look very different. And I think one of the innovations of this work and the ongoing keystone work, particularly for accounting and organisational studies, is to see different cohorts come together that have a relationship with an environmental problem or a social problem that you're seeking to address, and seeing how those relationships play out. So this is a snapshot of their corporate characteristics. Taking their ecological characteristics, and these numbers are estimates. And again, I'll explain the circles, and then I'll explain a bit about the process and how to read this picture. The grey circles is the stock volume. So the larger the grey circle, the bigger of the amount of materials, the volume of materials are farmed through this. The green colour then is the value. So there's some things that are like bluefin tuna, which is in the sort of overseen on the Middle Eastern part, North Africa part of the map here. That's quite a small volume, but they're very valuable species, so it's got a high stock value, not stock market, but stock as in fishing stock value. And the blue is wild capture. The yellow is some of the aquaculture materials, not all of the fish for all of these companies, but some of the big ones. And then the pinky purpley colour is the feeds. How to read this then? If we start off at Alaska, so 4 of the 13 keystone actors capture 40% of the volume of that fishery. So that's quite an interesting percentage. What those 4 companies, if they change their behaviour, then that would have a cascade effect on the rest. Likewise, one company has 23% of the capture of the Northeast Atlantic pelagics. In other areas, there isn't the concentration in around this biological measure. So 4 of the 13 companies have 6% of the volume of the white-legged shrimp market. So there's probably no leverage effect or possibility to change things in there. But this is it's an interesting map because it recasts our understanding of these companies, which we had in the preceding map. So it recasts them, but recasts it in a species and ecological picture. And this is indeed an early presentation of this material that I saw in a workshop that I managed to get invited to. And quite honestly, even now, it happens to me, my hair stood on end. Because as an accountant, I'm interested in organisations. I can tell you who's big. My theories tell me that big firms might be politically exposed and they might do particular things. I know that firms in dirty industries tend to do more things in these kind of areas. But I don't know what their ecological impact is. I have no idea because I'm not an ecologist. But here is the picture that helps me see that and helps join my accounting knowledge across to an ecological basis. It's also worth saying, because it links through to what happened next, is how was this information gathered? These estimates are gathered from publicly available data sources. And from my understanding of the story of putting this material together, the researcher who did it every now and then would sort of talk to some people in the companies and say, it would be much easier if you told me what you landed, and they said, no, thank you, please go away, as you can imagine. But then kind of like this back and forth and the starting of the conversation would lead to a question like, well, why do you want that information? And why is it interesting to you as a researcher? And so through this process of articulating this, this map, but also a great deal of additional work, it got that the researchers ended up in conversation with some of these companies that underlie this process. So what we move is from a keystone actor, which gives you a snapshot at a particular point in time of some characteristics, moved into a keystone dialogue. And if you want me to say more about how that happens, I will probably ask somebody on the call to say more about that. But basically what happens is, happened in this process is that science to business conversations took place, and that those one-to-one conversations were facilitated and enabled, and took a long time as well, to go back and forth to build relationships of trust and relationships of understanding what the researchers were trying to do and intersecting that with the concerns of the companies. Those back and forths and bilaterals turned into an opening dialogue with 8 of the 10 of these companies, where there was an initial dialogue with science sharing what it was worried about with regard to seafood in the future, and corporate insights about what they were worried about. And through that, a co-designed process has come together whereby these companies work alongside science to be able to fulfill a series of commitments that were made at that first meeting. So there was a series of commitments, which is on the website of this initiative, and progressively over time, these companies are seeking to make those commitments come real, but also are working with science to be able to find a way to do that. So if I were to characterise it for sort of organisational science people, this is a CEO to CEO leadership cohort. So the critical thing is that once a year, these CEOs get together and make, review progress and make future decisions. Once a year, their operational staff on a 6 months offset basis get together and check in with the scientists and make sure that they've got support in the materials and their progress towards achieving what was set out the previous 6 months. The companies have come together as CBOS, an official entity, and they pay into that in order to have support to do that. The science is all externally funded by philanthropic trusts. So as researchers, we don't have money from these companies to do the work we do, and that helps keep well, not to be reliant on funding, introduces more independence, etc. And what's interesting about this cohort to me as well is that there's a really super paper by Kang and Moon that looks at different versions of capitalism and how organisations behave quite differently in different places. And they pull out, Japanese companies is looking quite interesting and different. We've got 3 of these in here. And then also like an Anglo-American kind of mode of operating is also quite different, and then a Scandinavian mode of thinking about capitalism and how companies operate is quite different. So as a bit of an aside, there's a wee bit of a snapshot of a natural laboratory here about how these different organisations from different parts of the world with different underlying models of capitalism may be actually interacting in this process quite differently. In terms of what actually happens and what keeps us all nice and busy is that there'll be a commitment, and I work particularly in the area of forced labour. So and there's a task force on trying to eradicate forced labour from these companies' own operations, but also from their supply chains as well. So I've done some briefings on, the nature of human rights in business. How does that translate through? How do you get from the international protocols through to organisational commitments? Done some surveys of best practice of how people do that well and who would be good exemplars of that. Looking at modern slavery reporting and what does that entail and how could that be a useful driver towards organisational change. From time to time, we survey CBOS on a sort of like an arm's length sort of independent basis and present back to them what they as a cohort might be doing in terms of who's had what kind of policies, etc. We make very, very sure that we don't breach any antitrust requirements and those kind of processes. We co-design these dialogues together to help these companies learn from each other. We would work with them to try to develop tools and approaches that might be effective. So in any 1 year, I know that I'll be very busy this time in May because we're heading towards an operational meeting, and then busy in around October when the CEO meetings are on. But actually, I'm not always entirely sure what we will be doing, except that it'll be interesting and it will evolve and emerge out of the Science Business Partnership. As a part of the science cohort, we have desires and hopes that these firms will go far, but at the end of the day, it is their responsibility to go far or not. There is an idea, though, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go further, you go together. And I guess we're in that latter bit of it, thinking that these guys will be able to learn from each other, but also challenge and help each other be held accountable for the commitments that their original CEOs made in about 2006 or so. This is just a snapshot of the website of the various task forces and the kind of issues that we're dealing with. So to make sure there's no illegal IUU fishing products and raw materials, that there's no forced labour in CBOS member activities and their supply chains. So those of you who work in that area know how difficult that is. Creating improved traceability, which of course involves technology, as well as agreeing key data elements that can be passed from one firm to another, so you can trace materials across those supply chains through these tele-coupled nodes. Through to working with governments to improve regulations. And this is where, if you like, the voice of this team of companies, if their CEOs get together and say, if you regulate, we will be fine and we will make it work, is actually a really powerful and important voice to have in there. Across on the other side, they've made commitments around reporting, which of course we're tracking and interested in how that evolves over time, through to ocean plastics, through to climate resilience. So these are the current task forces. These will open out as other issues come into play, but also, and these are all moving at quite different speeds as well. So I want to sort of start drawing this to a close by giving you a sense of some of the sample of the time-bound goals. So these are off the CBOS website, so I'm not showing you anything that the world can't see if it chooses to look. And if you like, my colleagues who are working in the CBOS firms at the operational level are very busy trying to achieve these and other things as well. So some of it's about getting strategies together for issues that are quite early on in their consideration, endangered species and the use of antibiotics. Other ones are more long-standing issues that we've been working at for quite some time on IUU fishing and forced bonded and child labour in operations and across supply chains, through to getting a really clear sense of what emissions reduction trajectories the companies are on and how they're doing it. So what that brings me to is, and this, if you like, I mean, this project is going to keep me going for the rest of my working life and probably a bit more of that as well. Along the bottom is the external funders of the work. So I want to make sure that you notice that these people have been immensely supportive in allowing this work to happen. So some of the work in this area is the science for CBOS. So it might be, where would action need to be taken for endangered species? So where are the endangered species in the world? What kind of actions would you take? How do ports affect the landscape of addressing forced labour, IUU, etc.? Where are those risks? What are the best practice reporting? So these, if you like, are all quite specific questions there are also things on which papers are under development, but are also published in these kind of areas. But alongside that, and at least in part because of this co-designed and this joint working approach, we're also trying to do the science of CBOS. So you'll remember from the outset that the hypothesis was that if these organisations changed, if these keystone actors moved, then there would be cascading effects that would shift the whole industry. I mean, that's an open question. One of the things that we're about to head off on is looking at how their reporting transformed over the last 6 years. So a really fairly decent period of time in which we can look at 2 snapshots. Myself and a colleague, Madeline, who may be on this call, who's doing the heavy lifting on that, is doing a systematic literature review about how would you evaluate a corporate sustainability initiative using the best insight that we can find in the business and management studies as to how you might do that, and trying to construct an evaluation framework from that. But there's also tons of really interesting questions in here. So this cascade and this transformational effect, what is the timescale for that? It's definitely not 3 years. It better not be 25. But actually, do these issues that they're addressing, do they run on different kinds of timescales? How does your innovation and changes in procurement policy, how quickly does that happen? How long does it take for that to have an effect on the supply chain? How many interactions would a CEO need to have with another CEO to build trust, and what kind of trust would be generated from that process? An empirical question to which I don't know the answer. What kind of leadership do the CEOs and the operational people in this initiative demonstrate? We have been trying to collect some data on that and might have some insights to bring to them. Is there anyone shadowing this group? So my secret desire, and again with that model of change in mind, is that we might find out that there's 4 or 5 companies who are not part of CBOS, but who watch their annual meetings and see what their time-bound goals are and say, well, let's adopt them and do the same thing. So almost like shadow CBOS members of some sort. The final thing we're then trying to understand is that what are we doing together as natural scientists and organisational scientists? And we are certainly having a grand time together. I am finding out so much more about seafood than I ever imagined I could find out. And my natural science colleagues are more informed about accounting than they ever wished to be or realised they could be. But there is something about researching our own practice here as well, about how do you start to understand each other? And coming back to the paper on accounting and accountability in the Anthropocene, I really loved that paper, of all the papers I've written recently, because for us, the Anthropocene was the idea that we both knew about, both the natural scientists and the social scientists, and we assembled around that to tease out, well, what does that mean to us in the context of CBOS, and what does it mean to how we think about the work that we might do? And so trying to understand how that knowledge formulation process comes together is also part of the work. It's also immensely reassuring to be working in that area when I'm wanting to foster and support the work of the Pentland Centre, which, if you like, is another place where we're trying to think about how business itself, business researchers, but also scientific research might come together. And I want to leave you with one of my favourite pictures, which I don't, some of you would have seen this, but this tells me that corporate change is possible, because I'm not very good at being a cynic, even though sometimes I do feel dismayed. So I'd like to say corporate change is possible. So this is an advert from the past, from Humble, which became eventually Esso. They used to advertise that each day they supply enough energy to melt 7 tons of glacier. It's a fantastic ad. If you tried to run this now, I don't know what people would think of it, but it certainly wouldn't be good. So I think that there is a long process. It'll be a multi-generational process to sort out some of the problems that we have created collectively through human agency, organisational behaviour, and maybe poor governance processes, to deal with these absolutely critical areas of work. I'm going to get rid of it. So I've kept this on in case Desna had to ring me and say, nobody can see you anymore, do something different. But there you have it. Okay, so here are some selected references but I will also, happy to pass people any papers that they might find interesting in this set. And at that stage, I am going to finish this and stop sharing. So this should resurrect us back to where we were. Have I done the successful last bit?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks ever so much, Jan.